Well, hey, my name is Andy Kaufman, host of the People and Projects podcast. Thank you so much for joining us for today's podcast live stream. I really appreciate you joining. If you are watching this on YouTube, you've got the live chat there. I invite you to go ahead and type in there where you are joining us from. You can just say, hey, good morning or good afternoon, depending on what time zone you're in and where you're from. And let me give you a little background of the idea of our time together. I don't know if we all got our favorite podcasts. And what I mean by favorite is the ones we listen to most often. And a lot of times I'll listen to one and go, man, I really enjoyed that. I would have liked more. Or, man, I really enjoyed that. I would have some questions for that person. And so that's kind of the idea behind this, is a further discussion about, hey, what does that guest think about something? So today I'm going to have a conversation about the book, Be a Project Motivator, with Ruth Pearce. In fact, Ruth, go ahead and join our conversation here. Welcome to our live stream. This is Ruth. Ruth, how's it going today?
I'm great, thank you, and thank you for inviting me back. Good luck for punishment.
Yeah. Oh man, no, it's great. It's great, and I see that Joe has joined us from Phoenix. Joe, thank you for getting up early today. I know that was an issue. Got North Carolina joining here, and Jonathan, and oh man, Zaidi, thank you. Rock Island, yeah, thanks, man. Really appreciate your support over the years. Well, a couple things as we go through today. You can ask questions, and so you can ask a question. I'll pass it on to Ruth. Also, I'll post it into the chat now. You can also call and talk to us and leave a message as well. So the phone number and the meeting number is there. And so if you've got a question, here's what I'd like you to think about. Can you think of some people-related issues you've had on projects? Maybe it's now, Ruth, you've never had those. I know. Yeah. And of course, Ruth will have the answers to all of our problems, right, Ruth? Is that how it works?
Oh, yeah. Dear, I've just come from a coaching session where you have all the answers.
Yes, exactly, right. But anyway, inevitably we've got questions, and sure, we're not going to have the perfect answer for you, but if you'd like to say, so Ruth, I had this situation. This is a project thing. How might character strengths have fit into this? Or how do you personally deal with this? So this is access to, I want to tell you, somebody I just deeply admire in Ruth Pearce. And, Ruth, you know the backstory as well as I do on this of what led to us getting to the podcast episode. I mean, Matthew, thanks for joining there. I think of how long ago was it when I think it must have been on LinkedIn where we first interacted. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And then you approached me with, hey, I wrote this book, and, Ruth's book is Be a Project Motivator. Right? And maybe we ought to have a conversation about that. I'm like, yeah, let's make that happen. Right. And it took months before anything happened. Then we saw each other at the global conference. Where I was stalking you and during one of your talks, if I remember it.
When I did that crazy mindfulness thing that was supposed to have 30 people in it, and it had 110.
And actually it looked like more. I mean, it was like, and probably one of the worst settings for a session, in that all the noise, and you just handled it perfectly. I was so proud of you. I was so
Thank you, Andy.
Yeah. But we eventually got to episode 286 and Ruth on the podcast, and so I appreciate your patience through that. But I just feel like when you share content on LinkedIn is where I see you mostly, though I know you share content in many other places. I just feel like it's engaging. It's a way for you invite conversation, and so I really appreciate that, Ruth. Let me start by just asking you this: like, how would you say you are personally doing as you go through this lockdown that's got all of our attention around the world?
I hesitate to answer that question.
Yeah.
I am fortunate to be really, really busy, which I like. I've been doing a lot of different things, new things, to offer different ways to support people. And I am an introvert. So if you tell me stay home, don't go out, don't go anywhere, and don't hang out with people, I'm like, whoop-de-doo, how long can we make this last? So I am fortunate that it is relatively okay for me. I'm very fortunate that I don't have close friends or family who have succumbed to this. We did have a family member who got sick, but they've recovered. So far, I feel very fortunate that I'm not negatively touched by it. And I also feel very fortunate that for 57 years, I've been practicing introversion. And now finally I come into my own, it's like, yay, I can do this. So.
Yeah. But this whole issue of how we are wired does kind of spill out when people are in a room together, right? In a house together. And we'll talk about styles and strengths, but
and that's something I would add, is that I'm also very fortunate because I'm an introvert in a largish house with one other person who's also an introvert. If we had younger children, our children are in their 30s. So if we had younger children and we were all on top of each other and we were having to homeschool and we were having to do this, my experience would be very, very different.
Yeah.
So I am fortunate to be an introvert who's allowed to have an introvert existence during this time.
Yeah.
And that makes a huge difference.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an enormous gift in that regard. We've got a number of really good friends who are in the situation you described. They're in their house, kids of all kinds of ages, trying to share bandwidth, which room is the quietest because we've got our meetings, and it's an interesting time. And I would imagine character strengths have to come out during times like this. So I'm interested in, many people will have heard our podcast discussion, but let's say someone is relatively new to character strengths. Let's say they're actually new to it. And they're like, what are character strengths? Because they might be familiar with introversion, extroversion. They might be familiar with DISC and Myers-Briggs and things like that, right? But so how do you describe character strengths to people?
So I love character strengths because they are a combination of who we are and how we present ourselves to the world. And originally it's the VIA character strengths assessment, and originally VIA stood for values in action. So the things that motivate us and the things that excite us, that we hold within us on their own, their values, they don't become strengths until we do something with them. So it's that combination of what do we hold dear, what's core to us and who we are, and then how do we present that to the world. And that's one of the things I find fascinating about character strengths, is that we share 24 common character strengths, and there's many, many research papers that consistently back that up, that we have these 24 strengths.
Yeah.
And yet everyone actually displays and expresses those strengths differently. So the way I feel comfortable expressing love, for example, might be very different than the way you feel comfortable. We have a general similar understanding of what it is, so we know it when we see it. And at the same time, we're unique in the way that we bring it forth. And that is our character strength, of having that quality or trait, and then what we do with it and how we use it.
I love that. So it's not just because you look at the character strengths and they're all positive, right? None of them like, oh man, I came out as a jerk. And it's not role based. It's not like, oh, I'm supposed to be a farmer. It's none of those things. They're all positive, but it's how does one person express learning? Or for example, if I remember right, you were appreciation for beauty, bravery, it was a C. Curiosity, and then gratitude, and it was an H. I should remember what this was. Honesty.
Well, honesty, honesty.
Fairness. Or was it fairness and gratitude?
Yeah, fairness and gratitude. Yeah, and then honesty and hope, they kind of flip flop.
Yeah.
So yeah, those are my top 5, and it's interesting because I feel like I now I know about them. I use them very sort of consciously and mindfully. So my appreciation has helped a lot during this time.
Yeah.
I have become absolutely fascinated by the bark on the trees in my backyard, the way the leaves have come, out when this started, we were still in sort of end of winter mode. Now we've got full leaf and there's birds and all of that. So being able to sort of stand on my deck, and again, I'm very fortunate that I am right on a corner lot with wetlands behind us that's protected. So these trees and everything are going to be there for the long haul. And, I can really enjoy this. We had some bananas that we wouldn't eat because they'd gone bad, and not gone bad, but they'd started to be a bit sort of mealy. And so I broke them up and threw them out because I don't know, birds. I'd read somewhere that birds will eat them. Well, the squirrels love them. And one of the squirrels came and took half a banana, and it was almost as big as he was, and he was trying to climb the tree with the banana, and finally he gave up and just sat and ate it. That's my appreciation of beauty, appreciating nature and everything is really, really helpful. Bravery, I've been doing some things where, it's uncomfortable. Bravery is a weird strength because it's one of those strengths that's uncomfortable while you're using it. In fact, it might be the only strength where that's true. Most top strengths are energizing to us. We talk about them being effortless and energizing and essential to us. And I do feel that it is essential to me. It isn't always energizing when I'm using it because I'm usually doing something that's making me feel uncomfortable. And I've used that a lot recently by going and doing more live things, and with Veer Institute on Character, because I now do some work for them. We said, okay, we're going to start doing some live things starting Monday, and we just did it. And usually we do a lot of prep and mapping it all out and scripting it. It's like, we've got to get it out there because people need it now. So bravery's been, and then I'm always curious about this today, what will this look like? And what will one that you do in 6 months time look like? What will you change about it? And what, so, I'm fascinated.
Yeah. In fact, today took bravery, and curiosity, right? Because it's,
let's just do it. 11:15, a very obvious time to do it. No, it's just.
I think when we come up with the idea, maybe a week and a half ago, something like that. So,
And it was going to be on a Thursday, and then you did your poll of what's the best time. And so you used your curiosity and you used your love of learning there to find out what actually the audience wants. So, being adaptable.
In one of the test sessions I did on this, what we found out is there's like a 25-second delay between us talking and what shows up on YouTube and in the chat. So learning how to navigate that would be interesting. And just this last night, while I was kind of thinking about it, I thought, I think we'd have people dial in. So we're going to try that one too. So it is interesting.
Throw in another ingredient. So that's bravery, and that's hope, that somehow it will come together and we'll have a good enough result. It doesn't have to be perfect. But I'm also struck by, we're seeing that during this time of COVID, so what we find is that people, when they're using their top strengths, and you can take the free survey and find out what your strengths are, and you get a ranking of all 24. And as Andy said, they are all positive. We don't measure weaknesses. We only measure the relative intensity of these 24 strengths. And we all have all 24. You get your ranking. And what we tend to find is there are certain strengths that more often show up at the top, and those top strengths we tend to call that they're usually what we call signature strengths. And I mentioned before, they're essential to us. You can't imagine being you without them. They are effortless, as in you don't have to think about engaging them. They're at your fingertips, or they're on the tip of your tongue, kind of thing. And they are energizing. So while you're using them, you feel like your best self and the most energetic. And then we've got these ones that are more common to show up low down. So things like perseverance and prudence, the planning strength, tend to be towards the bottom for everybody. So if you see self-regulation is number 24, no surprise there. It's very true for everyone. And during this time, people are having to use those strengths more. We're having to self-regulate. We're having to plan. Even the most basic thing like going grocery shopping is now a major planning event where it wasn't before. Or having sufficient toilet paper. In the next couple of weeks, it will be having enough meat if you eat meat. And so there's this constant planning, which prudence is usually down for most people. It is down towards the bottom, and they're leaning on that strength a lot. And what we find is that's one of the reasons why people report feeling exhausted, is because they're having to use strengths that are not their natural go-to, essential them. And it's tiring. We know we have to do it, but it's just that process of being so mindful about things we're not normally is tiring.
Yeah, that's good. We've got a question from Syed. He said, is there a technique to refine on your natural strengths? For example, if you're passionate, how do you let that passion get expressed as calm and cool without, looking like you're pushy? So what do you think about that? Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's really interesting. We can
Yeah.
do a lot of things with our strengths. What an interesting question.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
So we have passion. So for me, passion, it kind of depends on where the passion comes from. So if we're passionate about people, for example, that may be a sort of love and social intelligence
Mm-hmm.
kind of thing. And
Mm-hmm.
so, expressing that empathy and support for people is then you focus on being where they're at, meeting them in the place they're in, rather than forcing your perspective on them. So that could be one form of that passion and connection and everything else. Sometimes passion is zest, so it's high energy.
Yeah.
And that's something that people like to be around. The lower zest is for them, the more tiring it is to be around someone zesty. So and I'm typically pretty zest, not one of my top strengths, but it is one, and it tends to be a low strength for people as well. It's along with prudence and self-regulation. It tends to be a strength that people rank towards the bottom. So if you are one of those zesty, passionate people, just keeping in mind, as you said, it can seem pushy if there's too much of it at once, and using that social intelligence to just observe, what are you seeing in the other person? Do you need to give them a moment? Do you need to pause? So it's always with our strengths, although we talk about the individual strengths, the strength in them really is the way we balance them with each other. So how do I take my zestiness and balance it with some social intelligence and some judgment to make sure that it's having a positive impact on people around me? And that may be context specific. You may be in one group where it's like, you can be like this, and then you're in a group where it's like, just a little slower, and being aware of that and just adjusting.
I love it, because it's, with almost every one of these things, whether it's strengths finders or whatever, it is designed to give you more self-awareness, or at least not self-knowledge. And then we have to have maybe the self-awareness to know, how do I express that? So I think in the interview you talked about, I believe as a stepson and you both have fairness as really high. And so if you get into a political discussion, you can't just be like, well, I'm just being who I am, deal with it. So you have to find ways using your social intelligence of like, I think we've covered this enough now.
Yes, that's right. It's time to move on to something like, dinner would be good. So, and it's interesting when you see parents with children, that one of the things that can be so challenging is, although children, we nurture them and they come from us, they sometimes have top strengths that don't match ours. And that can cause friction sometimes. I've heard of a young man who was in I think he was in, sort of like a reform home. I'm not quite sure what you call them in the US, but he was in one of these places because he'd been caught shoplifting or something like that. And his top strength came out to be honesty. And his family were not to say they were dishonest, but they weren't driven by honesty. That's not what motivated them. That wasn't a sort of primary motivator. And people said to him, honesty can't be your top strength because, you stole and you lied about it, kind of thing. And it's like he was experimenting with fitting in, how do I adapt? And once he realized that his top strength was honesty, it was like he'd been freed from the shackles of not understanding. And he came to understand that the rest of his family didn't hold honesty to be as high. So that wasn't where they were coming from in everything they do. And it explained misunderstandings and all that. And it happens a lot where parents assume that kids have the same values as them, and they actually don't. So
I love it. We've actually got a call. I'm going to go ahead and bring him into the conversation. I see it's area code 847. I see. You.
Hi.
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 Hi. This is Sarah from Chicago.
Hi, Sarah.
And thank you for taking our call. I'm just curious. You were alluding to it recently, but I'm wondering if you could give us another specific example of how character traits apply to parenting.
Oh, okay.
I know that. I know actually this is a subject you care a lot about, Ruth, right?
It is, and I wish I was more expert. There's actually a great book by Lee Waters, and that's spelled Lea, Waters, Waters, called the Strengths Switch. And that resource is an amazing resource for parents using strengths. So one of the things that there is a youth survey. So depending on how old your kids are, if they're older, you know, more like 15, 16, 17, they take the adult survey. But if they're younger, they can take this youth survey, because one of the things that we see, first of all, there's the language about how you assess the strengths is sensitive to what their language level is and their experience level. And also what we see is there are certain strengths that tend to build over time in children. They're not necessarily so high in them at the beginning. So social intelligence is something that's partly learned. And you know, a great deal of it is learned from what you see other people do and what works and what doesn't. Kids tend to be more curious. We tend to dampen down our curiosity as we get older, unless you're me and Andy, and then we just ramp it up. And so having them take the assessment can really help them understand who they are, because then you can talk about the strengths in terms of what's great about them, what's positive. And you'll start to notice, one of the things I do a lot with people is to have them strength spot. And if you know what your kids' top strengths are, you can start to see examples of them. And when you start to say, I really saw your curiosity in, you know, you come into their room, everything's on the floor, they've tipped everything out, everything is a mess, and you want to scream at them for being messy. No one's had that happen, I'm sure. And you want to be able to talk to them in a way that says, this is why you have to clean it up, right? And being able to appeal to them in terms of their strengths rather than your strengths can bridge that gap. So I think it's really helpful for the parents to take the adult survey and the children to take the youth survey, or the adult one if they're old enough, and just see, where do you overlap and where are you different? And you may be really, really surprised by some of the strengths that are high. It's not uncommon for parents to find that their kids' strengths are sort of the polar opposite of theirs, if you like, you know, that kids have got self-regulation when we haven't, or something. And when you come to understand that, it facilitates conversations that can start positive. I find it in the workplace as well, is it is much better to be able to say, I really appreciate your creativity. It's amazing to see all the things you do. And when you're done with the painting, the drawing, whatever it is, stuff needs to go away, because, you know, we want to keep the place tidy and all of that. But you've acknowledged the driver of why they tipped everything out of everything, because they were being creative and adventurous and experimenting.
Yeah, I love it.
That is great advice.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. Is it with an H or without an H?
Thank you.
Is this Sarah with an H or without an H?
Without.
It's my middle name, Sarah, but it has an H.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much.
You are welcome.
The Daniel Jackson, man, Daniel has left so many interesting points. He says, meet them where they are. You know, so it's because sometimes I feel like so much of the emphasis on strengths, I'm not saying your emphasis, Ruth, so much of our emphasis is, all right, so now you know about you, and so to the rest of the world, deal with it. And Daniel really appreciated your point. He says it reminds of Cubby Habit 5 about seek first to understand.
Yes.
And so even if you don't have curiosity, that doesn't mean you don't have need for social intelligence to try to understand.
And we all have some curiosity, you know, we all have all 24. So that's where you can choose to focus your curiosity. It's not one of your top strengths. You can say, it isn't one of my top strengths. It's not energizing. And at the same time, using my curiosity to find out something about the other person first is a good bridge builder, right? And character strength spotting. I mean, one of the things I say, I think I said it when we did the podcast before, was no one has ever said to me when I've said, I really appreciate your strength of X. What? I don't, you know, maybe I've said, I really appreciate your kindness. I've never had anyone say, kindness? I don't want anyone thinking I'm kind, you know, or if they did, I would probably run a mile. So doing that strength spotting, the chance, because we all use all the strengths to some degree, and we're always using a combination of strengths. We're never one strength exclusively. Whatever you think you see, you probably did. And so when you start saying to someone, I saw this in you, it is a really great connector, because they feel seen. And sometimes they'll say, wow, no one has ever described me as particularly kind at work before. Or they may say, I feel like I'm always trying to be kind and no one seems to notice. Or they may say, yes, that's one of my top strengths, and people say that a lot. But all of those are positive responses, and you make that little connection, and it is actually building social intelligence to do that.
Daniel also asked a question about the link to the survey. And what's VIA's website?
So VIA's website is viacharacter.org, VIACHARACTER.org.
Yeah.
And if you go to their main page, then you will see there's a link at the top that says take your free survey.
Got it. Yep. That's excellent. And then you can take it for free and see what your rankings are. And then they have paid versions of things if you want more detail.
Yes. Yeah,
but don't let price hesitate, cause you to hesitate.
That's right. Go find out your top, what your ranking is in 24, and that's a great start. You can find out more. You can go deeper by purchasing one of the reports. We're about to relaunch some of our reports because we've updated them, and I'm really excited about them coming out. They'll be coming out in the summer. There's also a course on there as well called Start with Strengths that explains the relationship of strengths to different domains of life. So happiness and workplace engagement and achieving goals and things like that. They're all quite short, little webinar things. So so there's more resources there, but just the basic survey is free. The mission of VIA is to have everybody know their character strengths.
Yeah, and in action. Matthew Harmon said, I find that I react to events emotionally, and how can one combat that and be more level-headed? So it's a little bit along the lines of what we talked about of learning to refine, but let's say that you're having a coaching session with somebody who they're like, all right, I see this in me, that zest, or maybe the fairness, or maybe you can think of some other ones that might kind of come up that is such a strength, but when they put it in action can sometimes make them feel like it's getting in the way of their effectiveness. So what about that?
And it's interesting because I'm actually doing, so Yale have got a course out that lots of people are attending at the moment on well-being and everything. It's through Coursera, and they're using the VIA Character Strength Survey as one of the tools. And so we've been invited to mentor. So I've been doing mentoring, and a few people have posted about how they react to things in an emotional way, and that they feel that those top strengths are getting in their way. Kindness was one that came up today, that someone said, she feels compelled to be kind to everybody, and then they take advantage of her. Fairness is one. It's weird that people who have fairness as a high strength, if they come across someone who doesn't share that sense that fairness is a driving force, they become the most unfair people in the world. It's like you're dead to them. What do you mean that it's not important that we treat everyone the same? And then people aren't saying that it's not important that we treat them the same. They're just saying that's not my driving motivation. And we really can react. One of the things I like to encourage people to do alongside the character strengths is some mindfulness practices, because one of the things we find with emotional responses is we're not really taught to name our emotions clearly. So we have a reaction to something and we feel it and we react, and then we go, oh, I wish I could have tempered that. And sometimes we think that we're angry about something, and it turns out if you really dig in, you're actually disappointed or humiliated, or it's something else. And we sort of put things into these buckets. And there is actually a clinical condition or a subclinical condition called alexithymia, which is the inability to name an emotion. And so I have taken recently, in combination with the character strengths, to using something called Robert Plutchik's Wheel of Emotions. And you can Google it. It is a free resource that is out on the internet. And it's this little sort of wheel or daisy with emotions on it. So it's Plutchik, Plutchik. And what I have people do is take a moment when they're transitioning from one thing to another. And of course, I don't know how many people on the call today are project managers, but we do that a lot. We're in a meeting and then we're going to the stakeholder thing, and then we're working on schedules, and then, we're back to a stakeholder meeting and all of that kind of thing. And what happens is we have interactions with people and our emotions get ramped up, and we don't pause and acknowledge them before going into the next thing. So sometimes we're irritated with one person and we take that irritation into our next encounter.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of I just did it as a casual thing in a workshop once, and several project managers said that was the most useful thing that I'd given them, which was nice and disappointing at the same time. But I'm really, really glad they've printed it out. And what they do is they take 30 seconds to think about, what am I feeling now?
Yeah.
Before they go into something else. They acknowledge those emotions. It's not a judging thing. And there are 5 facets to mindfulness, and non-judging is one of them. Non-reacting is another. And I could go on about that, the 5 facets of mindfulness all day too. But you don't judge it. You just acknowledge, I'm feeling irritated or angry or frustrated or disappointed. And what else are you feeling? Because we're usually feeling multiple things. Sometimes conflicting emotions about the same thing. So we can be sad about the current situation with coronavirus and excited by the opportunities that we personally have had during this time. And they seem contradictory, but they do live side by side. That is part of humanity, is to be able to, hold both things at the same time. Or we may be sad about one thing and excited by something else, and just going through and saying, okay, so I feel irritated by that last conversation. And I feel excited by what we're going to move forward with in this, and that we're coming closer to delivery or whatever it might be. And I feel nervous about the next encounter, and just naming those things gives us a lot more control over them. So that was a very long-winded answer, but
no. Actually, I love it, because I feel like this is something I wasn't taught. In fact, I feel like what was modeled to me, and I'm not just talking about parents, I'm talking about just in the world, is like, they made me so angry, right? So if it was naming it, it was blaming it on something else.
Yes, they made me. That's right. It's not my reaction to a situation. It is that someone else made me do it, and that's something else. Like, we own our reactions, whether or not we like them. No one makes you feel anything. You respond for various reasons. You respond in a certain way, and being able to name that response is the first step to being able to say, I'm going to put that to one side. I never say squash it or stuff it or any of those things. Don't deny it. But it's like, that emotion in this moment's not terribly helpful. I acknowledge it's there. I'm going to leave it, where it is, kind of thing.
But I got to tell you, Ruth, I feel like in my late 20s, early 30s, I struggled a lot with anxiety. And I feel like what I was being taught or told was, get over it, stuff it, or whatever. Don't name it. Don't. And so, there are so many things about the wisdom of just, I'm feeling scared about my job, or I'm feeling angry the way that I feel insulted by the way, whatever. But the wheel gives vocabulary, it sounds like.
Right. Yes. And it's very simple. I mean, there are thousands of emotions that you can name, but it's just a sort of starting point. And as you look at it, you'll say, well, it's not really quite any of those. It's more of and that pause of considering it, as I said, is the first opportunity to respond. And you said about anxiety. I've suffered on and off all through my life with anxiety. And that mindfulness, I discovered, I wanted to be mindful and meditate and stuff like that. And I struggled with it until somebody, my colleague, said that mindfulness isn't about staying in the here and now. It's about coming back to the here and now. And suddenly I felt liberated, because I wasn't very good at staying in the here and now. I'm always kind of, what if, and what if, and what if. And so, bringing myself back to, okay, what if? Okay, that's a concern. And today's Saturday. So why am I all tangled up? And it made a huge difference to me in terms of things. I still get anxious about things. They don't make me anxious. I still get anxious. But it's like the day of instead of 3 weeks ahead of time. I'm not anticipating so far in advance.
I feel like through many lessons, it's one of the benefits of not being in my 20s
I'm completely with you on that one.
Because it's not that we don't experience these emotions. It's that, can we catch it earlier and not stuff it? Can we catch it earlier and just say, okay, so it could be anxiety, it could be any emotion. Matthew was talking about kind of reacting emotionally. It could just be awareness earlier. And then what do we do with it? We might just watch it float down the river, or we might,
Yeah.
might say, I need to use this to try to express my passion because it's an important thing, right? But you can
exactly. We can make a choice. And one of the things we do in group coaching, so I do a lot of group coaching with people, is we use that wheel at the beginning and the end.
Yeah, I like
and
it.
so you see what emotions come up at the beginning. And
Yeah.
one of the reasons for doing that is partly, I'm hoping they'll say, wow, group coaching is great. And the bigger reason is emotions don't last as long as we think they're going to. So we have a tendency, especially negative emotions are sticky.
Yeah.
And so we have this feeling, I'm always going to feel this anxious. I'm always going to feel this overwhelmed. This is going to go on forever. This is my life from now on, and all of that. We do our group coaching, and at the end, they find that their mood has changed at least a little bit. And it's like, oh, we did this for 45 minutes or an hour, and it's changed already without focusing on, can I change the emotion? That's not what we were working on. And it is a real eye opener for people that, even feeling tired, people will come to group coaching and say, I'm really exhausted, and they finish group coaching and they feel energized again. Well, no one took a nap, I can tell you. Group coaching is not about napping. So
I like it. Yeah. I don't remember where I got it. It's actually at a client, and they had this, it was like a little flip thing, and you could pick your mood for the day. You're like, how are you feeling right now? And so the idea at the client was you could put it on your desk, and if you're walking up to somebody like, oh, you're feeling sad today or whatever, but it wasn't like 5 or 6. I mean, it was like, it looked like 80 of the thing. Yeah. But the one thing that I felt kind of consistent with what he said is it was almost like that's my mood for the day. But I think there's wisdom in what you said. I think it's good for all of us to hear today is just remember, like, all right, you can go through a really bad time. So I noticed that if I watch actually this morning, my wife went for a walk, ran into a friend we hadn't seen for a while. Her friend had lost her mom. She had been on a COVID floor, memory care. So many of the other people at this nursing home died. And so you come back from something like that and it can just whack you, right?
Yeah.
But and I'm not saying we try to squash it. Part of the being human is we accept that's the reality of what's going on, but that doesn't mean for the next week we have to also feel that same emotion. And so it's finding ways to navigate all that. Yeah. There's a comment that Joe from the PMO squad.
I did invite Joe to heckle, so
yeah, that's good. Well, not a heckle question. He goes, there's several tools, and he puts competing in quotes because they're not competing in that you only use one, but they're all designed to help us understand ourselves. So any thoughts on how to leverage the tools when the results or the output maybe even seem to conflict with each other? I think that's a really interesting question.
I knew he was going to cause trouble when I heard that Joe had got up early to join us. Thank you, Joe. So I have used various tools and assessments over the years. I've either taken them because I'm fascinated by taking these kind of assessments. Someone will say to me, have you seen this assessment? And I'm off finding it. And as long as it's not phenomenally expensive, I'll do it.
Right.
And what I've found is the magic of them is not in the assessment. It is how you unpack it and what you do with it afterwards. And one of the challenges that often happens is you're given a link by someone, they say, take the assessment, and then you take it and it's like eye candy. You see it and you have a reaction, because there's always that bit in these assessments that say, and the danger point for you is that because you're this and this and this, you're quite likely to, react this way or whatever it is. And you're left with that without any kind of coaching or guidance or anything to navigate your way through. So I think it is less about the assessment. And one of the beauties of the VIA character strengths is because everything is positive. There is no, first of all, you just get a plain ranking. There's no narrative about you. We don't interpret. Someone asked me the other day, if these are my top 5 strengths, what job should I be doing? And it's like, we all express the strengths different. It's frustrating because I'd love to be able to say, you should be a nurse or whatever. And at the same time, we do all express these things differently. And so it's finding out, how do we use our core strengths in what we do? And so I feel that, so it's like a non-judgment. It's just saying these are 24 positive characteristics that the world recognizes, regardless of culture or religion. And so when we come back to Joe's question about what do you do about these competing assessments, I would say find the one that is most interesting to you and then get someone who knows how to walk you through it. so that you can make the most sense out of it, because we want not just awareness, but actions we can take to be our best selves, right? And doing that on your own with a report that's just told you you're a megalomaniac is pretty challenging. So.
Well, I'm thinking that sometimes the most difficult part of a self-assessment is the word self. And so sometimes when I'm taking it, what I'm thinking about in PMO Joe's question is, if I'm thinking, if the recent context I've been in is this, I might answer different than if I'm in a different context or have some different experiences recently.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, I don't remember the questions well enough of the V. I took it, but I don't remember the questions well enough. Could my wife answer those for me and it be informative, or are the questions more internal that well, I mean, my wife would know really well after 31 years.
Well, so that's a great question. I'm so glad you asked it, and I didn't even know it was coming, but I'm excited that you asked that question, because one of the things we do is what's called a character strengths 360. And what we do is we pick people, we give them a list of strengths, and they highlight the 3 to 5 strengths that they see in you with example. They're supposed to write examples of, this shows up all the time, and you can give it to people in the workplace, you can give it to family members or whatever, and get that feedback. And of course, again, it is all positive, because we're asking people to say, what do you see as a strength in this person? And then you can, especially if you have a coach, but you can do it yourself anyway, is to do the comparison of which strengths did you find in yourself that other people are seeing. So there's the overlap. Which ones did you see in yourself that other people aren't seeing? So does that mean maybe you're underusing them, or you don't use them in a particular context, like the workplace? Maybe your family sees it, but the workplace. Love is a big one. I always come back to this one. Love is a big one for people. Are like, love, you can't use that at work. I completely disagree. In fact, I probably express love more comfortably in my work than I do anywhere else. And it's micro moments of connection. Barbara Fredrickson's work in Love 2.0 says that love isn't this all-consuming. We tend to think of romantic love, it's all-consuming. It is actually a series of momentary connections. And when we're feeling that intense excitement about someone, we're just having these they're very fast and they're joined together. And then as our relationship goes on, we do something else, and then we think of our loved one, and we sort of dip in and out. And what was the original question? Oh yeah. So asking people the 360.
When they compete, the 360, yeah.
And so getting that insight, because what you're asking people to say is, what do they see? And then you get to think about, am I putting my authentic self out into the world?
Yeah. I think it's, what I love about what you said there is, and it's tying it back to Joe, is the conflict might not just be against or across the tools. The conflict could be how I see myself versus how other people see myself. Which all just adds to our self-knowledge. That's my kind of response to Joe, is all of them are data points, and probably no tool is perfect, although some are probably designed and validated much better than others.
I mean, I like to stick with the ones that have been validated and peer reviewed and all of that, which the VIA one has. So that's another reason why I really like it. There's a lot of evidence behind it, not just made up.
But even still, the way I answer it could be different from how other people perceive me in different contexts. So
and there's another thing in there as well, which sometimes our strengths get in each other's way. So I had you mentioned before what my top strengths are: appreciation of beauty and excellence, bravery, curiosity, fairness, and gratitude are my top 5. And they are absolutely me. And that's something else we do in coaching, is just we validate that the answers that came out. It's a survey, and a survey is never as informative as the person's own understanding if you ask the right questions. But I have these 5, and I was a moderator at a conference panel session, and there were 2 speakers who were very well known and 2 speakers who were up and coming. And the panel decided each person was going to speak for 10 minutes, and then there was going to be Q&A for everybody, based on what the audience wanted to hear. And so one of the preeminent people, the names that people knew, got up to speak. He was the last person to speak, and he was going a little long. And my job was to say, 10 minutes is up. And my fairness was screaming, he has to stop, because it's not fair on the other people who didn't get as long. And my appreciation of excellence wanted to hear more from him. And my curiosity wanted to hear more from him. And if anyone's old enough to remember A League of Their Own, there's the scene where Mara Hooch is like going back and forth because she's getting conflicting instructions. I was like that. It's like, do I stand up and stop him? And do I sit down and let him carry on? And the audience was like, you do not cut him off. And fortunately, he was high in social intelligence and leadership. And he said, I can see that our moderator is conflicted about cutting me off, and we all agreed we were doing 10 minutes talk each, so I'm going to stop now and we'll go to Q&A. And I was like, thank you. I couldn't sort out that tussle between my conflicting strengths. So that's something else that comes up as well, is that even within ourselves, we're pulled, it can be pulled in different directions.
Joe, PMO Joe says a funny thing. He goes, whenever I do these and share my results with my wife, she always tells me, see, I told you that was you. You just didn't realize it. And it's a funny story, but it also illustrates that a lot of times people see things that we're just kind of blind to. And so that's why taking these assessments, though, even that perfect read, we learn more about ourselves.
Yeah. And that's another exercise I love to do. I was fortunate to be on a course with an amazing woman from Iceland, and unfortunately for her, in the second week of the course, her husband had a heart attack, and she wrote this. It was about strengths and mindfulness. She wrote this piece about what she went through, and there was a lot of mindfulness in there and a lot of positivity, and she gave me permission to use the story. And I read the story to people, sometimes as project managers, whatever it is, and they spot the strengths. So they have the 24 strengths up, and without fail, we get at least 13 strengths noticed by the audience, sometimes as many as 18. And so out of the 24, so, 2/3 or so are being identified, half to 2/3 being identified. She identifies 4 strengths that she thinks she and her husband together use on that day. And when I say that to people, so these are the 4 strengths she thinks she used, people are like, how could she not realize that, this came into it and this came into it? Because we're blind to what we're bringing to the table. So having that outside perspective can be really helpful.
That's good. Jonathan Norman says, you're talking about such an important and diverse range of skills and behaviors. And how do we encourage people to think about these things when they're working on a project? I think it's a really intriguing question, because sometimes we're just so, we're so busy. We're so focused or stressed about this that we don't take the time. So any thoughts of?
Yeah, actually, yes. And I'm glad you said that, because it gave me a moment to think. I think one of the key things is to do one thing. We tend to think that we need to sort of cover all the bases, and we end up not covering any of them. Focus on one thing that you're going to do. So one of the practices that I recommend, and I think we talked about this in the podcast, is I have people replace the sneaky looking at their phone under the table in conferences and meetings and on calls now. What's going on social media? Put that away and bring up the 24 character strengths and have the chart that's got the 24 character strengths. Listen to what the person is saying, especially if they're boring, and SEA, spot their strength, and then afterwards explain what you saw so they can repeat the behavior and why you appreciated it. So I saw this strength, and just do it for one person a day. And it can be something you see they've written in an email, that they had a really nice, kind, sensitive introduction to the email. As kindness, why, what did you see? This is what I saw. Why do you appreciate it? Because I feel like you're seeing me as a whole person, not just the person who delivers XYZ, whatever it might be. And you do that. And as I said, no one ever says, oh my goodness, I don't want you to think I have that strength. That's never, ever happened to me. And it's one thing that you do once a day. And then watch what happens. Because what you'll find is if you do it consistently, people will start to do it to each other. And they may not use the language of the VIA character strengths, but they'll find something. I notice that you just keep going at things. And I really appreciate that when the rest of us are struggling to keep going, you motivate people to do it. It doesn't matter how they describe it. It's the process. And you'll see it ripples. And that's what you're just doing one thing once a day for one person. And when you're consistent with it, it builds up and it makes a difference. And then you learn to integrate the other stuff as you go along. But do one thing, pick it and do it consistently. And, you'll see great benefit, and it builds from there.
In your influence section, you add to Robert Cialdini's Weapons of Influence, you add modeling. And I'm thinking that this is an example to Jonathan's question as well, that you started by modeling it.
Yeah.
You call it out. And I love how, and you talked about this in the podcast episode as well. Don't force it. Like we were talking about forcing gratitude. Like, thank you for tying your shoes, right? So you don't have to do that. And you don't go,
yeah, it needs to be authentic.
yeah, right. You showed bravery today. I mean, you don't force it. Just when you see it, just call it out. And I think it'd be kind of cool, especially when, and I don't think it's even fair to say, so I'm not using the right terminology, but when it feels like our strengths are in conflicting. Like if someone's taking a hard fairness stand, and maybe that wouldn't have been mine, let's say, but even if we call it out of like, listen, I gotta tell you, I appreciate and I see it, and this is how I saw it, but this is kind of how I see it added to the conversation.
Yeah,
we didn't make a decision just flippantly or something like that,
right. Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because I had a coaching client recently, and she's very creative. She has creativity and curiosity and all of that. And she said that perseverance and prudence and self-regulation are very low in her profile. And she said, I feel that those getting in the way. What can I do about it? How do I increase them? And I said, well, who do you know that's got them? And she actually decided that her challenge isn't that she doesn't have those. Her challenge is she surrounds herself with people who also don't have it. So there's no environment of discipline and planning and everything around her. And she's like, if I could find a couple of people whose mindset goes that way, then I'd be able to see what to do, what behaviors to mimic in order. So that's what she went off and did. And she actually joined a group, I think, that, was something to do with sort of planning and all of this kind of stuff, so that she could see what other people do. So you can borrow strengths from other people. You can build up any strengths that you want. We can absolutely cultivate them. And you can say, Matt, that isn't one of my top strengths. And sometimes it irritates me. And at the same time, I see it has value. So-and-so's got it. So let's call them in and say, from your perspective of whatever, what do you think? What would be the brave step forward? What's the fair way to tackle this? Whatever it might be.
One commenter says they really like that SEA. That's really good, Ruth. So powerful, and they're going to start practicing it right away.
Excellent.
So, yeah, isn't that cool?
Your job is done, Andy. We've got, we've got a convert, so we can go off and have lunch now.
Yeah, exactly. And Jonathan says, fantastic piece of advice. Thank you. I recommend Peter Garrican's The Feedback Game, which involves giving people a piece of feedback and saying, I'm giving you this feedback because. So it sounds like it gives some structure around how to do that effectively, instead of just the classic nice job or
exactly, nice job. I don't know what to do to get that comment again. But nice job when you spoke up on behalf of the people who weren't in the room today, and represented them. And it was brave of you to do that, because I know it's not your perspective. Okay, so now I know, I spoke for people who couldn't be there, and people appreciated it, or this person appreciated it. That's the behavior they saw. And I can do that. I can choose to do that again, which comes back to the question earlier about emotional responses. The more we know about what people appreciate, the more we can choose to take those steps and be that person in the moment, in another circumstance. So,
can you think of an example of a project team that had some sort of struggle? So, and you can pick what the struggle is, but that was the struggle, and how character strengths, whether it was the project manager or you as a coach, kind of helped intervene to deal with that struggle. Anything come to mind?
Well, what I found with people knowing their strengths, and of course, it's hard for a lot of people to go up and say, hey, let's all take our VIA character strength survey. That's probably not going to happen. But when people become aware of their strengths, and you observing those strengths is part of building their awareness. I see this in you, I see this in you. And this is how I see it, and this is why I appreciate it. And so you build up their self-awareness. What I see is two things. One is when people are aware of their own strengths and other people's, they can approach difficult conversations from a positive point of view. So coming back to what we talked about with parenting, really, really appreciate your creativity. And you still need to put everything away at the end of the day. And here's why, And So conflicts can get resolved because instead of us going and saying, here's the deficit you need to fix, which is the standard way that teams interact, you aren't doing what you're supposed to be doing,
Right.
And you need to fix it.
Right.
Sort of professional development is always, you've got this gap and you need to fix, that you piss people off when you speak to them or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And to be able to go and say, I see this strength in you. And I don't know if you realize that sometimes, it crushes other people because it comes on strong, or for these particular people, it's overwhelming because some of that's context specific. And the other thing I've found is that people will sort it out themselves. So I had a case where a design team, the design lead was high in judgment, and that judgment is the critical thinking strength. So weighing evidence.
Mm-hmm.
And his team would come and say, and some people may have seen a version of this in the book as well. The team members would come and say, I've got this great idea for how we should do this. They're designers. So, it's a great idea, blah, blah, blah. And the way he was using his judgment was to counterbalance their enthusiasm by giving them 65 reasons why it won't work. And people stop coming up with ideas. I mean, if you keep going and saying, I've got this great idea, and the person says, well, that sucks because of this, in the end, you stop doing it, right? And they did their characters. And I was racking my brains for how was I going to tackle the conversation we needed to have? I already knew from him taking the survey that judgment was his top strength. He volunteered to share his profile. The team recognized, and they were creative. The team recognized what was going on. They all sat down together and came up with a strategy for how he was not going to do that to them in future, and how they were going to get back to, being creative and making designs, because they had a language to speak about it.
Yes, that's it. That is it.
Language.
There's something about, I don't know, it seems so obvious, but when we have vocabulary, it makes a difference.
Yes.
And
absolutely.
I think that's something I'd love for people to take away from this. Take the survey, go through it, and add this to your vocabulary.
Yeah.
And consider your team to do it. In fact, I missed the question that Daniel had before, because he's a high school entrepreneurship instructor.
Mm-hmm.
And, he puts people through a semester-long project. And, I'm thinking that this could be a kickoff exercise, it could be, or for a new team, part of the chartering of a new team.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we do lots of things. I do lots of things with teams where we build the team profile. So everyone takes the survey, and then we build a team profile. It doesn't name names. It just takes the top 5, because those are your signature strengths. It takes the top 5 for each person and builds a profile of the team. And then we discuss what that looks like for people. And what you'll find is you'll have certain strengths that may be very, very common across the team. And that can become an in-group, if people know about in-groups and out-groups, because there's a language there and a comfort with, if they're really, really high in honesty or something like that, everybody's driven by that. And the 1 or 2 people for whom that is not a top strength struggle because they're not communicating in the same way. And they can, someone who's high in spirituality, for example, they're likely to be in a pretty small minority. Well, that feeling of connection is core to them. So what do you do as the rest of the team? How do you make them feel that connection, and that there's a bigger purpose, and that you're all working? And spirituality doesn't have to be the same as religion. It's just this sense of purpose and meaning and everything. And, how do we make space for the people who don't have the same strengths as us? And it's an awareness thing again. It's not that anyone's, anti the person with spirituality. They just don't recognize it because it's not a high strength for them. Being aware that you have someone like that. I had a guy who was high in humor, and he was on a team that was high in honesty, and everyone took everything he said literally.
That's funny. Yeah, exactly. So that would drive each other crazy. But
I mean, he'd be like, what is wrong with you guys? Clearly I'm joking, and they'd be acting on what he said when he didn't mean it. And once they figured that out, he was the only person in a team of 110 people who had humor as a signature strength.
That's interesting. Well, here's the deal. We Matthew said bottom strength, self-regulation, says the guy who reacts emotionally. So insightful. That's really good. So thank you. Ruth, I said it at the top, but let me just say it now. I so admire you. I love your passion. I love the way you think things through. I love your generosity, not only just today and in the podcast episode, but how you share your advice so generously. I love how you span different in groups. It's not like, you're parts of many different groups. It's not just project managers. It's not just this. You find ways to apply all that. And I want to thank you for joining us today on the podcast live stream. Let me just say, for those who are listening, chances are a lot of us met on LinkedIn or maybe workshops. But what I'd love you to do is follow Ruth on LinkedIn, and you'll be better because of it. So she will share lots of advice. And if somebody wanted to follow up you with a question, what would be the best way, Ruth, for them?
Email me at Ruth Pearce, all one word. So RUTHPEARCE. Sometimes people go for the default, at projectmotivator.com. All right. And that email is also on my LinkedIn profile as a contact email. So yeah, I love questions, in case you can't tell. So please do follow up with any questions you may have. And as a parting thought, if I may, Andy, for everyone who's going, oh yeah, self-regulation, that's really low for me. If you have ever, we all have all 24 strengths at our disposal to some degree. If you have ever woken up in the morning and said, oh, I just can't, I'm not going to get up today, and you got up anyway and went about your business, you have self-regulation.
There you go. Well said. I love it. Well, thank you, Ruth, very much. People cheering for you. Lots of thanks on the chat. So thank you very much. And for everyone joining the live stream, thank you. Thank you for joining in the chat. I appreciate that. In fact, we'd love some feedback on this. So if we're connected on LinkedIn, send a message. What did you like about it? What do you think we could do better? And so I would appreciate that. So Ruth, thank you very much. Those listening,
thank you, Andy.
Thank you very much. Have a lovely rest of your weekend.
Yeah, you too. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.